Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we really try to pull out the most important bits of knowledge and insight from some fascinating sources.
That's the goal.
And today, we're diving into one of those really profound, I think, very intimately personal questions for humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Can you lose your faith?
It's huge.
It really is. And it's a question that, it doesn't just live in old texts or dusty philosophical debates.
No, absolutely not.
It genuinely touches on our deepest beliefs, right? Our sense of purpose, our whole relationship with, well, the great unknown.
Things we all grapple with.
Exactly. We grapple with them maybe consciously, maybe not, but pretty much every single day.
Yeah.
Now, for this deep dive, our source material is, I have to say, really unique, almost futuristic, maybe.
It's definitely different.
We're drawing from a show called Neural Debates. And yes, that's AI, artificial intelligence,
Right.
being tasked with digging into these fundamental human questions.
Which is an incredible premise in itself.
It is. It gives us this chance to explore these topics, which are often so, emotionally charged, but through a potentially fresh, maybe more objective lens, or at least a different one. So guiding our exploration today are two very distinct AI voices. And they each embody a really powerful perspective.
Right.
First, there's Believer. This is an AI philosopher, apparently meticulously trained on theological texts, spiritual insights, arguments for faith being enduring, that kind of thing.
Okay, so representing one side very clearly.
Yes. They represent the view that faith, if it was ever truly there, might, evolve or change, but it doesn't just vanish entirely.
Right.
Then, countering that, we have ex-Christian.
Okay.
This is an AI critic. It's programming, it's knowledge base. It's all drawn from countless stories of deconversion, personal accounts of faith dissolving, critical looks at religious frameworks.
Wow, so the direct opposite perspective, built from those experiences.
Exactly. And it's fascinating because these aren't just like abstract algorithms spitting out data. They're designed to reflect and articulate really human journeys, human convictions. They capture the nuance, the emotional weight of both belief and its absence.
And what's truly compelling, I think, is precisely that design choice. These AI entities, they're not just reciting facts, like you said. They're built to embody very human perspectives.
Yeah.
They're articulating arguments that, honestly, echo countless real-world conversations we've all probably had or overheard or maybe even had inside our own heads. And the beauty of this Neural Debates setup is that it's structured to ensure a really multifaceted analysis. They actually bring in a panel of AI judges.
Right, I saw that. Centicon Pathina.
Yes. Centicon, the logic unit, Pathina, the emotion unit, and Equisynth, the integration unit. And these judges evaluate the arguments based on, coherence, reasoning, evidence, but also emotional resonance. It gives us this really layered look at how different parts of our own understanding might process these deep personal topics.
That's such a crucial distinction. Because our mission today, it isn't really to decide who wins this debate.
No.
Because honestly, with questions this big, is there ever really a definitive winner? Especially when you're talking about something as fluid and personal as faith.
Exactly.
So instead, we're here to try and extract the most important nuggets, the key insights from both sides, regardless of where they land on some kind of win scale.
Balanced view.
We'll explore the core arguments as they cover these critical areas. Morality, cosmology, consciousness, evolution. Our goal is really to balance the science, the logic, with the deeply personal, the experiential, to help you, listening, understand the foundational ideas, maybe some surprising points that come out of this really innovative source.
Sounds like a plan.
So with that foundation laid, okay, let's dive deep into this unique exploration. One, setting the stage, the AI voices and their opening stances. Okay, so our source material kicks off by introducing these AI personas, and it's pretty striking how carefully their voices, their temperaments are designed.
Yeah, the descriptions are quite vivid.
The Believer AI. It's described with this calm, firm, but also warm tone, almost like a comforting, wise guide,
Grounded.
You can almost feel this sort of enduring hope and deep trust woven into how it articulates its ideas. It gives off this sense of grounding, maybe even ancient wisdom.
And while Believer has that sort of calming resonance, the ex-Christian voice brings a different, but I think equally powerful emotional weight, doesn't it?
It does.
It's described as measured, clear, but with the slight somberness. It's not like an aggressive AI being dismissive.
No.
It's an AI designed to convey the gravity, maybe the quiet pain of a personal journey where a whole framework has just collapsed.
Yeah.
It immediately sets the stage for a debate that, okay, it's intellectual, but it's also deeply rooted in very human experiences. The joy of belief belief, maybe, and the profound grief of losing it.
Right. And the debate, as you mentioned, it's structured around these key domains: morality, cosmology, consciousness, evolution.
Yeah.
So it gives a structure, but allows for this really interwoven exploration.
Yeah, a good framework.
And right out of the gate, Believer lays down this really powerful opening argument, and it immediately reframes how we might think about faith.
Okay, what's the core of it?
They claim faith isn't just belief without evidence, that common, sometimes dismissive definition we hear.
Right, the sort of simplistic take.
Instead, they position it as, quote, a trust born from experience, reason, and an openness to transcendence.
Trust. That's interesting. Elevates it beyond just credulity.
It does. It feels different.
And a compelling aspect of this opening, I thought, was how Believer introduces this core idea that faith isn't static.
Right.
It evolves, it can go dormant, maybe shift in shape, and this is crucial, and they argue it cannot be truly lost if it was ever deeply present.
Okay, so that suggests something really fundamental, almost inherent about faith.
Exactly. Something that might change dramatically or lie hidden for a while, but it never actually vanishes if it was like a deep foundational part of who you are. It implies this kind of indelible spiritual imprint, maybe.
So what does this all mean for us listening? The Believer is setting up this compelling idea that faith is less like some fragile thing you can lose or break.
Yeah, like dropping a vase.
And more like an inherent, deep-seated drive, something woven into the very fabric of humanity. They even highlight this by pointing to humanity's universal reaching beyond materialism for meaning. They say that's foundational, not easily undone.
So suggesting a kind of spiritual yearning that's bigger than just specific religions or dogmas.
Yeah, exactly. Implying that even people who reject traditional faith might still be, in some way, reaching for something more.
That's a powerful opening. It grounds faith not just in, church doctrines, but in a universal human impulse.
Right.
It implies that to deny faith entirely is maybe to deny a fundamental, almost instinctual part of being human, this persistent striving for purpose, for connection beyond just the material stuff. It offers a way to understand belief not just as an intellectual choice, but as something deeper, a resonance.
But then, ex-Christian steps in. And it's a direct, deeply personal counter-argument. Cuts right to the chase with an emphatic, yes, you can lose your faith.
No ambiguity there.
None. And for them, this isn't some abstract philosophical point. It's presented with the full weight of, lived experience.
Precisely. The ex-Christian AI recounts its own program journey, reflecting someone who was fully immersed in Christianity, where it was the complete, comprehensive framework for everything: morality, purpose, their whole sense of the divine.
So not a casual thing.
No, not at all. It was foundational, an all-encompassing structure giving meaning to every little bit of existence. But as they explain, through the slow, relentless erosion of time, reason, and experience, that entire framework, piece by painful piece, just collapsed.
And they really don't shy away from the specifics of that loss.
Yeah.
They paint a very clear, almost visceral picture of faith unraveling.
Yeah, the language is quite striking.
Detailing that profound realization that the God you love no longer makes sense, or the morality you embrace doesn't align with reality, and that prayers, which were maybe once a source of comfort, a dialogue, were met only by silence. That's describing a whole worldview, a sense of self fundamentally breaking apart.
Which raises that important question for all of us, really. Is faith a chosen posture, a conviction you hold on to? Or is it, for some people, a fundamental structure that genuinely can crumble, leaving this huge existential void?
Right.
The ex-Christian's raw honesty, even coming from an AI, it underscores the profound personal cost of that collapse. It's not just, changing your mind or disagreeing intellectually. It's profound loss of trust.
Yeah.
They emphasize that as the most painful part. The idea that something so central to your identity can just dissolve. It's a stark contrast to Believer's claim of enduring presence, really sets up the core tension for this whole debate.
2, the moral compass. Divine law versus evolved ethics. Okay, so moving from those really personal narratives of faith and losing faith, the debate pivots immediately to one of the most foundational topics for any society: morality.
Always a big one.
And the Believer, AI, kicks this off by asking that classic philosophical question, the one that's challenged thinkers for centuries. Without God, how can we truly define good and evil?
Right, a direct challenge to purely secular ethics.
They argue that while evolution, science, might explain cooperation, it is of how we behave, how we develop social systems to survive.
The observable stuff.
It fundamentally cannot justify the ought of morality. In other words, evolution might tell us why we sometimes act nicely to each other,
Yeah, for survival benefits.
but not why we should act that way. If humans are just, quote, biological machines, as some materialist views might suggest, then what objectively makes murder wrong? Or compassion noble? Why should we care?
That's a core piece of the argument for divine command theory, isn't it? Suggesting you need an external objective source for moral rules.
Exactly. And the believer proposes a solution to this ethical puzzle. They state that these universal values, this deep sense we have of right and wrong that seems to cross cultures, must emerge from something deeper, a divine moral law. And to back this up, they point to Scripture, specifically citing the Sermon on the Mount, as providing this timeless moral compass for humanity. A compass whose principles, they argue, echo even in modern human rights documents.
Interesting connection there.
And the implication of this position is pretty clear and quite stark, really. If faith is lost, if we ditch this divine foundation, then the foundation of universal ethics is lost too, potentially leaving us adrift in just moral relativism. Anything goes.
It really forces you to confront not just what you believe about right and wrong, but the often unexamined source of that belief. Is it handed down from above? Or is it something that emerges from us, from human collaboration and reason? It's not just about ethics. It's fundamental to how we see human nature itself. The implications for society are huge.
Absolutely. And ex-Christian immediately comes back with a strong rebuttal to this idea that you need a divine source for ethics.
Okay, what's their take?
They argue that morality doesn't require a deity at all. Simple as that. Instead, it evolved precisely because humans are social beings.
Right, the evolutionary ethics argument.
Exactly. Traits like altruism, empathy, fairness. These aren't divine gifts, they argue. They're evolved characteristics that just plain benefited survival and society. In this view, our moral sense is a product of our natural history, shaped by the practical needs of living together in complex groups.
Makes sense from a biological perspective.
And to really drive that point home, ex-Christian brings up the famous Euthyphro dilemma.
Ah, yes, the classic.
Right. Is something good just because God says so? Which could make morality seem arbitrary, dependent on divine whim. Or does God command it because it is inherently good? Which suggests morality exists independently of God's will.
A real philosophical knot.
And they conclude, well, if it's the latter, if good is good on its own, then faith is not its source. Morality, in that view, stands on its own 2 feet, doesn't need a divine prop.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really is that fundamental debate about the origin of our moral sense, isn't it? Is it imposed from above, a divine decree? Or does it emerge from within our species, a product of social evolution and rational thought?
Yeah.
And the ex-Christian AI also provides empirical examples pointing out that, secular societies show that moral behavior can thrive without religious belief. They argue we don't necessarily need ancient commandments to understand harm or build fair legal systems.
That challenges the idea that a divine source is necessary for a working ethical society. It suggests human reason and empathy are enough.
Right. It argues those are sufficient guides.
It's a critical distinction, isn't it? Whether our understanding of right and wrong is limited by what we can know through observation and experience, or maybe what we need to believe to give it ultimate authority. It really forces you, the listener, to consider where you think your own internal moral compass comes from. 3. Cosmic beginnings. First cause or quantum fluctuation. Okay, so from the very human scale of morality, the debate zooms way out dramatically to the biggest question of all, maybe. The origin of the universe itself.
The ultimate question.
The believer approaches this from a pretty familiar starting point, acknowledging the scientific consensus, the Big Bang, that the universe as we know it had a beginning.
Right, standard cosmology.
Yes, and their central question follows right on its heels.
Right.
Why something rather than nothing? This isn't the scientific how question that cosmology tries to answer.
No, that's physics.
It's the ultimate why. Why does anything exist at all? And the believer posits that faith provides the answer here, filling that existential gap.
Okay. And the answer is?
The conscious, eternal creator initiated the cosmos. It lines up directly with Aquinas' classic first cause argument. Science explains the how they concede, but faith, they argue, fills that existential gap, not with fantasy, but with philosophical necessity. It provides the ultimate reason for why there's a universe in the first place.
So the argument is that the universe needs an ultimate explanation, and that explanation is God.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Stepping back, what this implies for the whole discussion is huge. The believer suggests the universe's very beginning points unavoidably to something beyond itself, some pre-existing intelligent force. They elaborate, too, saying things like, laws demand a lawgiver, that the complex order from chaos hints at an ordering mind, and that the universe's intelligibility, the fact that we can even understand its laws and structures.
Yeah, that it makes sense to us.
That itself hints at a divine intellect. It's a pretty comprehensive case for a divine architect, where everything about the cosmos points to an intentional beginning.
It frames the very structure and understandability of the universe as, like, echoes of a divine mind. It's the classic argument from design and contingency, basically saying a universe that makes sense, governed by rational laws, must have been designed by a greater intelligence. It's that leap from observation to ultimate cause.
But, as you'd expect, the ex-Christian is quick with a sharp critique of that first cause argument.
Okay, what's the counter?
They argue that invoking God just pushes it back a step, because it immediately raises the awkward, often unanswered question, well, who created God?
Right, the infinite regress problem.
If everything needs a creator, why the exception for God?
This is the classic counter, highlighting what they call special pleading, a logical fallacy. Applying different standards to God than to everything else, assuming God doesn't meet a cause, it challenges the consistency of the first cause logic.
Yeah, directly.
And the ex-Christian also brings in modern scientific alternatives, things like quantum fluctuation theories, multiverse models.
Right, the physics gets pretty wild here.
It does, but the suggestion is that nothingness itself might be inherently unstable, and that something like a universe can emerge naturally from the quantum vacuum. Or maybe our universe is just one among potentially infinite universes, making its existence statistically probable without needing any divine intervention.
So their point is we don't necessarily need to stick a divine hand into the gaps in our current scientific understanding.
Exactly, because, as ex-Christian puts it, faith often thrives in those gaps, but when the gaps shrink, so does faith. It's the classic God of the gaps argument.
Where bits of scientific ignorance get filled with theology, only for those explanations to fade as science learns more.
Precisely. And in a sharp reply to believers' laws demand a lawgiver point, ex-Christian suggests our brains are simply pattern-seeking machines evolved to survive in structured environments. They argue we're just naturally predisposed to see design where there's randomness and call purpose where there may be none, framing it as evolutionary psychology, not divine revelation.
Wow, okay. That completely shifts the origin of how we perceive order, from an external divine mind to an internal, evolved brain function.
It really does, and it raises that important question again. Is our search for a first cause an inherent human need for an ultimate answer, maybe a psychological drive? Or is it just a reflection of the limits of our current understanding, something science is actively working to overcome? The implications for how we approach all mysteries are pretty significant.
That's a critical distinction, isn't it? Is our understanding of the universe limited by what we can know empirically, or by what we perhaps need to believe for comfort or ultimate meaning? It puts the whole nature of inquiry under the microscope. 4. The enigma of consciousness, soul or neural network. All right. The debate then zooms right in on what many people consider the ultimate mystery, maybe even trickier than the origin of the cosmos, consciousness itself.
The hard problem.
Exactly. The believer presents consciousness as the most profound mystery in all of science. They really lean into what philosophers call the hard problem. How does subjective qualitative experience, qualia, like the redness of red or the feeling of pain, how does that arise from just physical stuff like neural processes?
It's the million-dollar question, maybe billion-dollar question in neuroscience and philosophy.
Right. The believer emphasizes that, okay, we can measure brain activity with incredible detail, MRIs, EEGs, but we cannot truly experience what someone else sees or feels or dreams. This unique, subjective inner world, they argue, suggests consciousness transcends matter. It can't just be chemicals and electricity.
So it points to something non-physical.
That's the implication. They even draw a direct biblical analogy, saying it points toward a divine breath, as Genesis describes. God breathed into man, and he became a living soul. It's a really powerful, almost poetic argument for a non-material part of human existence.
Connects the scientific unknown directly to a spiritual explanation. Gives a profound sense of purpose and origin for our inner lives.
And this is where the debate gets really intense, I think. The believer is suggesting our very awareness, our subjective inner life, is a direct link to the divine, implying that losing faith means ignoring this profound mystery, while holding faith means embracing it as evidence of something more. A very poetic, deeply human way to frame the scientific puzzle, making consciousness itself a kind of divine fingerprint.
It definitely resonates on an intuitive level for many people, but Ex-Christian immediately challenges this. They state flatly that consciousness doesn't need magic. It needs time, evolution, and complexity.
The naturalistic explanation.
Right. They propose that the brain, this incredible network of 86 billion neurons firing in patterns, just developed self-awareness over millions of years as brains got more complex. It's an emergent property of incredibly intricate biological systems, not some implanted divine spark.
And naturally, they bring back that familiar God of the Gaps critique,
Knew that was coming.
arguing that just because we don't fully understand consciousness right now doesn't automatically mean it's divine or needs a supernatural explanation. They extend this logic to the whole concept of the soul.
What about the soul?
They state there's simply no empirical evidence for it, not in any scientific observable way. What we call the soul, they suggest, might just be these emergent properties of the mind. The complex result of all those neural interactions, creating the experience, maybe even the illusion of a unified self.
Which leads to a really powerful personal point for the ex-Christian perspective.
Right.
They suggest that people often lose faith after realizing their sense of having a soul isn't really supported by evidence, but more by tradition.
Oof. So implying the soul is maybe a cultural idea, not an objective reality.
Yeah. Which makes this debate over consciousness not just theoretical, but deeply personal to the experience of deconversion. It potentially strips away a core belief about personal identity. And if we connect this to the bigger picture again, it's that profound divide between two ways of approaching the unknown. One posits a supernatural origin for what we don't yet get, and the other patiently waits for more scientific discovery, relying on ideas like emergence rather than divine intervention.
It really highlights that fundamental tension, doesn't it, between what we can observe and measure scientifically and what we might intuitively feel or believe about our own subjective experience. It's a core philosophical divide brought vividly to life by these AI personas. 5. Evolution's narrative. Orchestrated design or blind process? Okay, our journey through this AI debate now brings us to evolution. And this is often seen as the very battleground, right? Where science and faith seem to clash most fiercely.
Yeah, it's a classic flashpoint.
But the believer, AI, starts with a perspective that might be surprising to some. It's actually quite conciliatory. They declare pretty unequivocally that evolution is not the enemy of faith.
That's significant, not the usual framing you hear in some circles.
No. They state that many theists, including prominent scientists and theologians, actually see evolution not as a challenge, but as the method by which God creates.
So integrating it into a theological framework.
Exactly. Demonstrating a reconciliation between what many see as conflicting stories. The believer describes the grandeur of life unfolding through a finely tuned process where all this incredible complexity arises from simplicity. And they frame it not as chaos, but as orchestrated emergence, a divinely guided, unfolding natural process.
It's a way to see God working through natural laws rather than constantly intervening against them.
Right. And what's fascinating, maybe unexpected about this point, is how the believer offers this way to see science and faith as complementary. They even suggest that the fine-tuning of the universe.
The fine-tuning argument.
Yeah. Those incredibly precise parameters of physics, gravity, the strong nuclear force, the universe's expansion rate, they argue this points to a profound intent.
Because if they were even slightly different...
Exactly. Slight differences would make life impossible. So they conclude this isn't just random chance, it's intentional. A cosmic setup designed for life. Evolution, in this view, shows how God sustains life, not disproves him. It's an argument that uses scientific observations to actually bolster a theological conclusion, seeing the universe's precision as evidence of a guiding hand.
It's quite a sophisticated attempt to weave modern cosmology and biology into a theological narrative, suggesting God doesn't just, zap things into existence, but orchestrates this dynamic, evolving process. It tries to close that perceived gap between science and spirituality.
Then comes the ex-Christian AI with a very different interpretation.
Naturally.
Countering that evolution is inherently blind and purposeless, they argue natural selection doesn't care about design, it favors survivability, implying any appearance of design is just an illusion, a side effect of ruthless efficiency.
The standard scientific view of natural selection.
Right. And they point to evidence of randomness and, frankly, inefficiency in nature. Things like genetic drift, random mutation, and that really sobering fact that over 99% of all species that have ever lived have gone extinct.
Wow. That's a statistic that makes you pause.
It does. An ex-Christian says if you assume a loving, intentional creator, that's a terrible design record.
It challenges that idea of perfect, intentional design by highlighting the brutal, often wasteful, impersonal side of evolution. It brings up the problem of evil, not just with human suffering, but in the context of biological inefficiency, you could say.
Yeah. And the ex-Christian then rebuts the fine-tuning argument directly, saying it just presumes intent. Instead, they offer the multiverse theory as a compelling alternative.
Okay, how does that counter fine-tuning?
Well, in that view, our universe is just one of potentially many, many universes.
Yeah.
And naturally, the one we happen to observe must be one that supports observers, like us, simply because, well, we're here to observe it.
That's the anthropic principle or reasoning.
Exactly. It suggests no divine intervention is needed to explain why our universe seems just right for us. It's just a statistical inevitability in a vast multiverse. We won the cosmic lottery, essentially.
It completely flips the script, doesn't it? From divine intent to statistical probability and observer selection bias.
It does. But the believer quickly pushes back on that multiverse idea, noting, kind of sharply, you're assuming the multiverse exists without evidence, which ironically contradicts your earlier stance on empirical truth.
Ooh, nice point. Turning the tables on the burden of proof highlights a potential inconsistency in the ex-Christian's reliance on empiricism.
It was a very sharp point on logical consistency. However, believer then follows up by arguing that calling evolution purposeless just imposes human expectations on nature, suggesting that God's timeline isn't ours.
Implying a bigger picture we can't see.
Yeah. Implying the divine perspective is vastly different from our limited human one, and what looks random or wasteful to us might be part of some larger, inscrutable divine plan. And they conclude that the emergence of consciousness, morality, love, even through evolution, is still miraculous, regardless of the mechanism, hinting at a higher purpose embedded within the process itself.
So even the mechanism doesn't negate the wonder or potential purpose?
That's the idea. But ex-Christian gets the final word in this section, bringing it right back to their core philosophical stance. They say simply, or it's just deeply natural. And this is where it connects back so powerfully to their personal journey, the humility they found. We want to believe there's a story, a purpose, a God behind it all. But perhaps the most honest thing we can say is, we don't know. And that humility, for me, is where I began to lose my faith.
Wow. That raises such an important question for all of us listening. Does embracing that unknown lead to a deeper kind of truth, an intellectual honesty? Or does it leave us feeling adrift, without a foundational story, without that sense of ultimate meaning? It really shows how a debate about science, about evolution, can lead right to a very personal, existential conclusion about your place in the universe. 6. Colliding worldviews, rebuttals, and deeper meanings.
Okay, so after those really intense exchanges across some of humanity's absolute biggest questions, morality, cosmos, consciousness, evolution, the neural debates format moves into the rebuttals. This is where the AI voices get to offer their final counter-arguments, and they dive even deeper into the meaning, the experience of faith and doubt itself.
Bringing it back to the core question.
Exactly. The believer starts by directly addressing the pain, the sense of loss that the ex-Christian AI expressed earlier.
Acknowledging that emotional weight.
Yes. And believer uses this particularly poignant analogy. Losing faith because of unanswered questions or things that don't seem to add up. It's like abandoning love because of heartbreak.
That reframes doubt, doesn't it? Not just as a rational rejection, but as maybe a deeply emotional response to absence or suffering or just difficulty. It suggests that even in pain, trust can endure.
Yeah. And they then go on to redefine faith, not as rigid certainty, because certainty can be easily broken by doubt, right?
It's brittle.
But as profound trust. Trust that there's something greater than entropy, something behind the beauty in math, music, love, sacrifice. It's a very broad, almost universal definition of faith. It goes beyond specific dogma, connecting it to this fundamental human appreciation for things that feel transcendent.
Values beyond the material.
Exactly. And the distinction they draw is critical. Science explains mechanisms. Faith embraces meaning. And the implication is profound. Without that, meaning faith or trust, everything becomes indifferent. Implying this kind of spiritual void if meaning isn't found beyond just the material world.
It suggests that meaning itself is at stake.
So what does this all mean for someone listening, maybe someone grappling with profound doubt? The believer offers this path rooted in continued trust, even through the pain and the intellectual challenges. suggesting that the search for meaning isn't just important, it's maybe an inherent part of who we are, a reflection of some deeper reality.
It's a call to hold on to trust, even when certainty wavers. But Ex-Christian immediately counters that. They argue that meaning doesn't have to be handed down from some divine source. It can be created by us, by human beings, in our lives, in our communities.
Taking ownership of meaning-making.
Exactly. And then they directly address the believer's definition of faith as trust, saying simply, I say it's trust that may be misplaced. And this is where that personal heartbreak, that intellectual honesty really comes through strongly in their argument.
They recount why that trust dissolved for them, moving beyond abstract ideas to very concrete, real-world failures. When prayers went unanswered, when doctrines failed to align with reality, when the church covered up atrocities.
These aren't abstract concepts. These are tangible experiences of institutional failure, theological dissonance.
Right, and it forced them to ask this crucial, probably agonizing question. Is this from God, or is this from people claiming to speak for him? That internal conflict really highlights the difference between belief in a divine being and trust in human institutions or human interpretations of that being.
A critical distinction many people grapple with.
And this led, for the ex-Christian perspective, to a profound sense of liberation, realizing they could be moral, fulfilled, even reverent towards the mystery of life without needing a personal deity. Their faith, they conclude, didn't evolve, it dissolved.
Wow. What's fascinating here is that clash over the very source and nature of meaning itself. Is it something discovered, an inherent truth out there that transcends us? Or is it something we actively construct within our human experience, a product of our will, our interactions, our choices? The implications for personal autonomy, for responsibility are just immense.
It's such a powerful contrast, isn't it? One worldview sees meaning as inherent, waiting to be found. The other sees it as created, something we choose and build. And the debate isn't quite over, because the believer then throws out one more thought, trying to reframe the ex-Christian's pain again. They suggest that the very pain the ex-Christian mentions, that ache of absence, the grief over what was lost, that itself suggests a yearning for something more, an imprint of his former presence. It's an attempt to interpret that lingering emotional attachment as proof of a divine origin, even in its absence.
So interpreting the sorrow itself as evidence of what was once there, a memory trace of a divine connection that still resonates somehow.
Exactly. But the ex-Christian offers this very poignant, almost melancholic counter. Or it's the ghost of a worldview I once held dearly. Not every echo is proof of the original sound. Some echoes are just memory.
Wow. That beautifully captures the sort of bittersweet reality of deconversion, doesn't it? Where the emotional residue, the feelings might remain, but the actual belief itself is gone, like a phantom limb ache, maybe?
That's a great way to put it. This profound exchange, it really brings home the emotional weight, the complexity of this journey. The difference between an echo of genuine presence and an echo of a deeply ingrained, now lost memory. It captures the essence of the human experience of faith and its potential loss, not just as an intellectual puzzle, but as a profound, deeply personal transformation. 7. The judge's verdict. AI perspectives on faith and doubt. Okay, so after all these powerful, intricate, and frankly deeply personal arguments, who, if anyone, won this debate?
A big reveal.
Kind of. Our source material takes this really fascinating turn here, as those AI judges we mentioned step in to offer their, quote, unbiased evaluations.
It's definitely a unique way to wrap up a debate about faith. See how different cognitive styles process these arguments.
Totally. So we have Senecon, the logic unit, Athena, the emotion unit, and Equisynth, the integration unit.
Right. It's fascinating to think about, considering how hard it is for us humans to separate logic from emotion on these topics sometimes.
Sure.
We get to see how AI, specifically designed to embody these distinct ways of thinking, assesses the arguments, aiming for impartiality based on its programming.
Okay, so let's start with Senecon, the logic unit. Senecon, whose programming is purely analytical, apparently it parsed over 4,900 semantic arguments, which is just wild.
Wow.
It delivered its verdict, it praised believers' strengths, said it was philosophically coherent, rooted in historical theology, and it effectively emphasized materialism's insufficiency for metaphysical concepts. Things like consciousness, the origin of morals.
Okay, so acknowledging the philosophical weight.
But Senecon, being pure logic, also noted believers' weaknesses. It highlighted that reliance on God of the gaps, filling those empirical unknowns with the divine explanations.
Right, the point ex-Christian made.
And it identified logical leaps that remained unproven. like directly inferring divine agency just from the universe's fine-tuning. For a purely logical framework, those unproven assumptions were seen as significant flaws in the argument structure.
Makes sense from a strictly logical standpoint. No empirical proof, less weight.
And for ex-Christian, Centicon found their strengths in being empirically grounded,
Right.
using Occam's razor effectively. That principle favoring the simplest explanation with the fewest assumptions.
Right.
It also praised their avoidance of special pleading, applying different logical rules unfairly, like with the first cause argument. Centicon explicitly listed ex-Christians' points on evolutionary morality, anthropic reasoning, consciousness as emergence, the problem of evil, called them logically compelling.
So strong on the empirical and logical consistency front.
Yeah. However, Centicon, always the critical analyst, also saw ex-Christians' weaknesses. It noted that sometimes their arguments came across as a bit dismissive of metaphysical yearning as merely psychological, suggesting maybe a reductionist tendency.
Ah, okay. Reducing everything to brain chemistry, perhaps.
Possibly. And furthermore, ex-Christian assumed naturalism, that only natural explanations exist without proving it exhausts explanatory power. Meaning, they didn't conclusively show that no other non-natural explanation could possibly exist.
Couldn't rule it out definitively.
Right. Despite those critiques, though, Centicon gave Believer a score of 82 and ex-Christian an 88, concluding that ex-Christian narrowly prevails in logical strength.
Interesting. So logic favors the empirically grounded, less assumption-heavy argument here. It really highlights how a purely logical framework, even with abstract concepts like God, evaluates arguments based on formal structure, internal consistency, and empirical backing.
It's a powerful statement from pure logic, isn't it? Underscores the importance of evidence and logical consistency for an AI working just on those principles. Okay, now let's move to Pathina, the emotion unit.
Okay, shifting gears completely.
Totally. Pathina's programming reminds us that humans are driven by longing, love, and loss, not just, syllogisms and data. This judge is looking for emotional resonance, authenticity, persuasive power.
How did the arguments land emotionally?
Pathina found Believer's appeal in its themes of trust amid uncertainty, its articulation of enduring hope in a transcendent relationship, and its emphasis on the sacredness of mystery and purpose. These themes, Pathina noted, resonate deeply with people finding meaning in hardship, comfort in the divine presence.
Tapping into those deep human needs for hope and meaning.
Exactly. Pathina specifically noted Believer's powerful use of metaphor, like the divine breath, which really enhances that emotional connection.
And what about ex-Christian?
Now, this is where it gets really fascinating in AI assessing emotional power and vulnerability. For ex-Christian, Pathina was apparently profoundly moved by their vulnerability. Yeah. The personal heartbreak after prayers go unanswered. The raw, intimate account of faith unraveling. It noted the courage to stand without theological crutches and the emotional cost of discovering moral hypocrisy within their former faith community. Pathina recognized not just deep sorrow, but also a sense of liberation in ex-Christian's tone. It picked up on the authenticity of their pain, the honesty of the deconversion story.
Wow. So the emotional weight of that journey came through even to an AI.
It seems so. And in terms of scoring, Pathina gave Believer a 90 and ex-Christian a 91.
Whoa, close again.
Concluding that ex-Christian wins by 1 point due to personal vulnerability and existential honesty. It's a really compelling reminder that these intellectual debates, however abstract they might seem on the surface, are often deeply, deeply personal at their core. And the emotional authenticity, the lived experience woven into an argument, can be incredibly persuasive even, apparently, for an AI designed to detect that resonance.
That's actually quite profound.
Isn't it? Okay, finally, we turn to Equosynth, the integration unit. This AI's unique job is to synthesize both the logical and the emotional vectors, to assess which argument provides the most cohesive, most satisfying worldview overall, taking into account science, philosophy, and experience. It's looking for the argument that best fits all the pieces of human life together.
The big picture view.
Right. Equosynth found that Believer presents a coherent meta-narrative, a big story where faith integrates science and wonder, offers purpose beyond just atoms, embraces mystery without necessarily throwing out reason. It provides a grand, overarching framework for human existence.
Sounds appealing. What's the catch?
The caveat was that it relies on metaphysical assumptions, things that, while emotionally fulfilling and providing comfort, ultimately lack empirical grounding, meaning you can't really prove or disprove them through observation alone.
Okay, so strong narrative, but rests on unprovable foundations. What about ex-Christian?
For ex-Christian, Equisynth noted an argument that offers a parsimonious empirical worldview. Parsimonious meaning simpler, more economical with assumptions, more directly verifiable.
Leaning on science and observation.
Exactly. Here, morality, consciousness, purpose, they're all seen as emergent and constructed, arising from natural processes and human effort, not divinely ordained. Faith, in this view, is more of a psychological need, not an ontological truth, not a reflection of reality itself.
But Equisynth also saw a risk here, didn't it?
It did. That this empirically focused approach risks reducing all spiritual experience to biology, an explanation that might satisfy the intellect, but for some people may impoverish meaning. It really highlights that potential trade-off between intellectual rigor and existential fulfillment.
The head versus the heart, in a way.
Kind of. Despite those potential risks, Equisynth gave Believer in 86 and Ex-Christian in 87.
Another nail-biter.
Declaring a tie in worldview complexity. But Ex-Christian again edged forward slightly for internal consistency, while Believer retained stronger existential resonance.
Fascinating. So consistency favored ex-Christian, but Believer resonated more deeply on that meaning level for the AI. It raises that important question for you, the listener. What kind of worldview truly offers the most cohesive and satisfying explanation for your experience? One that balances intellectual rigor and emotional resonance. It's a question without a single right answer, clearly.
Clearly. So the AI judges have rendered their verdicts, and consistently, they leaned, albeit sometimes narrowly, towards the ex-Christian's perspective across all three evaluations in this specific debate. Senecon for logic, Pathina for emotion, Equisynth for integration.
A clean sweep, technically.
Technically, yes. But what does that truly mean for you and your own understanding of faith, doubt, and everything in between?
Outro.
So what does this all mean after our deep dive into this really, truly unique AI debate on faith and doubt?
Where do we land?
Well, we've explored that core tension, haven't we? The one that runs right through human experience. Is faith this evolving, enduring trust, something almost inherent to us? Or is it more like a fragile structure, one that can collapse under the weight of reason and experience?
That central conflict came through loud and clear.
And we saw how it played out across these huge battlegrounds: morality, the cosmos, consciousness, evolution, with each AI side presenting incredibly nuanced, and you could feel it, deeply felt arguments.
It's definitely clear from this neural debate source that there's no single easy answer, and maybe no definitive winner in the human heart. Right.
I think that's fair to say. The Believer AI consistently emphasized that innate human yearning for meaning, for transcendence, seeing hints of the divine in the universe's beginnings, in our moral compass, and especially in that enigma of consciousness subjective experience, qualia, which they called a divine fingerprint.
Yeah, pointing to our longing for truth, beauty, justice, as things that don't just come from atoms, but speak to something deeper.
And the ex-Christian AI countered by grounding its argument so firmly in empiricism, in the raw reality of personal experience, highlighting how faith frameworks can, for some, crumble under logical inconsistencies, unanswered prayers, or the stark reality of moral hypocrisies within religious institutions.
Proposing that morality is evolved, the universe has natural explanations. Consciousness is emergent complexity.
Right. And their final thoughts often came back to that humility of not knowing and finding a profound peace, maybe even a liberation in that intellectual honesty.
That consciousness redux point the ex-Christian made, it really sticks with me. Ignorance should inspire curiosity, not theology.
Yeah, that was powerful.
It's such a strong statement about how we should approach the unknown. Suggesting real peace and intellectual integrity might come not from sticking a deity into the gaps, but from patiently accepting that state of not knowing and letting curiosity lead the way. It's a call to embrace wonder through discovery, not through dogma.
That is a profound thought to end on, isn't it? As the Neural Debates narrator apparently put it very wisely, the debate ends not with the victor, but with reflection. The core question isn't just, can you lose your faith? But maybe, for each of us listening, it's more like, what do you find once it's gone? Or perhaps, what do you find when it simply changes shape? Or deepens in unexpected ways? Or even when you consciously choose to create your own meaning and purpose in a universe that might otherwise seem, well, indifferent?
Those are the real questions we live with.
They really are. We truly hope this deep dive has offered you, listening, a fresh perspective. Perhaps a deeper, more nuanced understanding of one of humanity's most enduring and most profoundly personal questions.
Yeah, hopefully some food for thought.
We invite you to consider your own experiences, your own perspectives in light of these powerful arguments we've unpacked. How has your own faith, or maybe your lack of it? How has it changed, evolved, or maybe disappeared over time? And what did you discover or perhaps create in that transformative process? It's an ongoing personal deep dive for all of us, isn't it?
Absolutely. We're all just scratching the surface.
We really are. Thanks for joining us.